From the Post Building in downtown North St. Louis, this is Inside City. This week I got caught up with Dick Fleming, a prominent figure in urban development and economic growth. With over 40 years of experience as a civic entrepreneur across multiple major cities, Dick played a pivotal role in Denver's economic resurgence during the 80s and 90s. Currently, Dick serves as the CEO of Community Development Ventures, where he continues to contribute to urban revitalization efforts, including the development of the Downtown North Insight District. Hi, Dick. Thanks for coming by today.
Oh, delighted, John, and enjoying these podcasts.
Thanks. This is actually my inaugural interview in this room. We were downstairs for a bit, so the background looks a little different than the previous ones, and but we're here at the Post and excited to have you on the show today. So thanks for giving us a few minutes. Dick, we could really start a lot of different ways, but I think previous to St. Louis, you were in Denver. And people go to Denver now and they think they've got it all figured out, but it really wasn't that way. And you had a couple of different roles while you were there, and starting, I think, in 1980 or thereabouts.
Yes.
So talk about what Denver was then and how you found it and maybe how you left it.
Well, interesting contrast. I had been recruited there from, interestingly enough, from the Carter administration. Had been in the sub-cabinet at HUD for 4 years and had cut my teeth in this field in Atlanta with their version of Civic Progress, which was a lot more laser focused on the center city than our Civic Progress had been. But I was recruited there to emulate what we had done in Atlanta with Central Atlanta Progress, which was more of a public-private partnership focused organization. When I got there, the energy boom was just out of control in Denver, in Dallas, in Houston, in Tulsa.
When you say the energy boom, what do you mean?
Energy companies, for whatever reason, were leaving Canada and flocking to the United States to put their headquarters. I think at that time, Denver was the 30th largest city, and we had the 7th highest number of office spaces in a central business district. Land values during that time, when I went there in mid-1980, went from $50 a foot to $1,000 a foot,
Wow.
If you can imagine that. Buildings were being thrown up as fast as you could build, some good, some bad. One of our first challenges with the organization that I helped create out of a former traditional downtown organization, the organization we created was called the Downtown Denver Partnership, focused on urban design, focused on historic preservation, focused on economic development, and focused on downtown management. We created, I think, the first business improvement district in the country, a 70-square block district where the property owners taxed themselves about $3.5 million a year, but contracted it back to the private sector to do supplemental maintenance, management, security, programming of spaces, cafes, whatnot.
And this would have been sometime around 1980. So
Yeah.
people talk about SIDS and public-private partnerships, but at that time, you're saying that was a very new thing.
Yeah, I think New Orleans and Denver were probably two of the first ones to do that. Now they're all over. It's really kind of become a best practice. But we went from that period where we were also opening a $76 million mile-long transit mall, which had been designed by I.M. Pei, was a transportation improvement with terminals at either end to intercept 500 buses that used to wind through downtown Denver and get the riders to use the transit mall and get on a free mall shuttle. Pei even designed the shuttles.
They're very modern.
Yeah, they were like horizontal elevators. You just jumped on and off. And that all was working very well. The 12,000 people a day that were forecast to ride the shuttles because they were free ended up being 100,000 people a day. And it was because people discovered they could park, even if they weren't on one of the buses, they could park on the edge of downtown and walk to the mall and get on the shuttle and go to their destination.
So one of the issues that St. Louis has is it's somewhat decentralized. You just don't have that that concentration of people that was even, that's part of the problem with the urban core.
Yeah.
Was Denver experiencing a similar decentralization thing for different reasons, or there was enough there that drew people in?
It was pretty spread out. You had a bit of a concentration on 17th Street, which was the financial district, and then the 16th Street Transit Mall paralleled that. But the rest of it was a lot of surface parking lots waiting for Canadians to develop office buildings.
Sounds the surface parking lot sounds familiar for
We
downtown.
can identify with that. And then the world changed. And in the mid 1985, 1986, the bust happened in energy when oil went upside down in terms of price. We had completed office leases at $40 a foot on the Republic Plaza, which was a 40-story building, that all of a sudden went to $15 a foot. You can imagine what happened to developers, what happened to institutional investors.
And was this also when the higher interest rates in the 80s also
Yes.
were impacting that?
Yes, very much so. And so Denver went from boom to bust. I, at that point in late 86, got recruited to become CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, the Metro Chamber, to succeed a 22-year incumbent. Federico Pena, a state senator, had run for mayor and had defeated a 16-year incumbent, upset him for mayor. By the way, on a campaign theme, Imagine a Great City, which was sort of talking about we need to plan for our future. And Roy Romer, who was the state treasurer and a very successful agribusinessman, was elected to succeed Governor Dick Lamb, who was term limited and became governor. And I can recall the governor was elected the first Tuesday of November. I was named as the CEO of the chamber the second Tuesday. And I think the next week, Roy and I met in his office by his whiteboard, and it was one of these now what the hell do we do meetings. And among the things that we talked about, two things we talked about, was we have to continue the effort of economic development, but we have to collaborate instead of pirating jobs out of the city and calling it economic development. We need to create a regional model. And secondly, we have a broken airport. And rather than just fix the broken airport, perhaps building a new airport would both generate economic growth, but also fix the problem. And
That's interesting. And so in terms of the path forward on that, I guess it was a combination of city, state, and federal to get something like a new airport built.
it very much did. And it ties back to St. Louis, ironically, in ways people would never imagine. First of all, to his credit, Mayor Pena was open to the idea, but he said it's a big part of the city budget that where the land is, 55 square miles, is outside the city. There was a very onerous annexation provision as a state constitutional amendment from the 1960s. And the only way you can annex the land into the city was by a vote of the people being annexed. And the people in that county did not like Denver. So one of our tasks at the chamber, working with the governor and the mayor, was to lead two successful campaigns, the second of which we beat Roger Ailes 2-1, because the compelling issue to the citizens in that county to annex 55 square miles of their land into the city was their sons and daughters would have to leave Denver to have a job. And it was absolutely true. And so we got through the two votes. We annexed the land. We then went to the federal government. I believe it was the Bush administration. Sam Skinner, I think, was the Secretary of Transportation, who later became the president's chief of staff. And we got a big chunk of $5 billion of federal money to build the airport.
And this was in the late 80s, right? Mid
Yes,
to late 80s.
it was late 80s.
And so similar to St. Louis, not to interrupt where you're going, but St. Louis the city owns the land where
Right,
the airport is now. So I wasn't aware, when you go out there, that airport is so far disconnected from, you go past miles and miles
Right.
of nothing. And I always wondered
Right.
why that was. And I guess the reason is this is what they could get done
That's
with the
right.
annexation in which
That's
county. So
that's
that's pretty
right.
interesting.
That's right. When we were getting the big federal commitment, Secretary Skinner said, by the way, you can thank St. Louis for the fact that this money is here. And we said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, this actually was originally committed as the solution for the federal government of a mid-continental new airport, international airport, which would have been built in St. Louis, quote unquote, in Waterloo, Illinois. But it got right up to the finish line, and the civic community in St. Louis at the time told Senator Eagleton they didn't want the airport, quote unquote, in Illinois. And Carter had just become president, and the funds got pulled, and they never got reallocated until the Denver airport.
That's interesting because I had heard about the potential Waterloo Airport. I didn't realize that. And again, the time frame on these things seems not years, but almost decades sometimes.
Yeah, it is.
And the idea that could the community get together on this side of the river to benefit another state, to invest in something that's landlocked. And I'd always heard that either the leadership wasn't there, or the people couldn't get there, or there wasn't the vision of what that could become.
Yeah,
And why have it go over to Illinois, can be self-serving, but you could also understand why people wouldn't want to necessarily give that up, because Lambert would have wallowed a bit.
Yeah,
And,
it's a shame that the vision at the time, and perhaps that's changed some, wasn't the region is a bi-state region, and that's an advantage. That half of the geography of the 16-county metro area is in Illinois. And there are many advantages in terms of things that can be done there. But,
with a two-state approach. But at the same time, you also have to get that side of the political process on the same page.
No
It's
understanding
very different.
that.
I think you and I were at a meeting where I don't know if it was a chamber, but gentlemen from Columbus, Ohio, and they think very regionally and holding. But again, that's one state, and they got together a number of years ago, and now they're doing great things about Intel putting a large plant there and things like that. But it speaks to how leadership matters, and that civic group getting together, showing leadership, government, and all that those things can happen, and that's what we need to have for the region.
Yeah, and the first of those two issues that Governor Romer and I talked about was how do we get the region working together in economic development? And to that point, economic development consisted largely of, in the 6-county Denver metro area, of the suburbs taking jobs out of the city. Economic development consisted of, unfortunately, suburban jurisdictions raiding companies out of the city of Denver.
Sounds very familiar.
Right?
Yeah, you put certain incentives in place, and you're just cannibalizing off each other.
What happened as a consequence of the challenge of the economic downturn and the energy bust, people realized that it wasn't going to continue to generate jobs naturally. And so we created a sister corporation to the chamber called the Greater Denver Corporation, had a pretty focused agenda: new airport, funding arts and cultural and science organizations in the region that were taking a beating in terms of the economic downturn, marketing the region as a region, because we had all these different jurisdictions marketing themselves separately, and accompanying that to create a thing which at the time was a bit unique, called the Metro Denver Network. It was literally negotiated as a peace treaty, including the governor, including the mayors, including their economic developers. We had 20-some members of it. We had a group called the Crazy Six, which were the largest economic developers, with whom we worked as the regional chamber and the Greater Denver Corporation. And our role was to be the honest broker on neutral ground, was to be agnostic as to where a deal went, and to share all inbound leads, to proactively market the region together. And it operated in a very collaborative way, which was a big change from where it had been. We even had a ceremony where we had a 10-foot high ladder and a sponge board where the governor got up on the ladder and was the first signator, and each mayor signed it and each economic developer signed it. And the remarkable thing that happened during that time was we doubled our close rate. We recruited 240,000 jobs in deals that we worked on in 6 years.
I was going to ask what time frame? 6 years?
Over 6 years. And that's continued. The person who was my head or our head of economic development at the Chamber and the Greater Denver Corporation went on to succeed me as the CEO of the Greater Denver Corporation. Very talented fellow named Tom Clark, who sustained and continued that effort, who in his own right became a leader of the whole transit-oriented and development effort and the multi-billion-dollar expansion of the transit system. So those two drivers really had a big impact. Back to the airport, it fixed the aviation congestion problem, but we had hired Booz Allen to do an independent analysis of how many construction jobs and how many permanent jobs would a new airport generate. And they projected 10,000 construction jobs and 90,000 permanent jobs as a direct result of the airport. There were at peak 10,000 workers on that site building the airport. A few years ago, then Governor Hickenlooper, now Senator Hickenlooper, had a number of us back to celebrate the 20th anniversary of DIA. And and the Business Journal back there asked the mayor and me each to do a sort of retrospective article on how it had happened. And I put those two numbers in my piece, 90,000 and 10,000. And a person on Governor Hickenlooper's staff called me the week later and said, the governor wanted me to call you and point out that there was an error in your number. And I thought, oh, here we go. Chamber exaggeration. Yeah. We overpromised. He said, we've done an update to that number, and it actually turned out to be 179,000.
About
so
double.
It was
then.
double.
Yeah.
So
that were just to the airport and nothing else.
Yeah,
to say nothing of other growth.
Directly through the airport. Yeah. And here's where I think what Rhonda is on point and really heading in the right direction with Lambert. It's a different set of circumstances. As you said, the good news is the city owns the land. The other good news seems to be the airlines are asking for it. Back when we were doing DIA, Frank Lorenzo was the head of Continental, and United and Continental were at one another's heads. And if one seemed to be benefiting, the other would be against it. Here you've got airlines who, by and large, say they want the reconfigured terminal. Without question, it's going to be an improvement in terms of an asset, but it's also going to generate net new jobs that would not have happened.
In terms of just really talking about Denver and seeing some interesting parallels of where they were, well, it's hard to admit that the 80s were 40 years ago,
I know.
Dick.
Aging both of us.
Yeah, right. But there is a path forward that a lot of people feel that the question I get more often than not is, what do we do about downtown? And how to deal with that? But it seems that it's the same types of things in terms of leadership, getting public-private partnerships together. I think our honest broker, without question, is the Taylor family, and they've entered the room with GSL that will hope and has helped with a few big wins here just recently, and then not resting on their laurels either.
I recently at the GeoResolution conference the other day had an opportunity just to chat with Andy Taylor, who I think the world of, and thanked him for what he and his family are doing philanthropically, in particular the Taylor Geospatial Institute. I suggested to him that coming out of the leadership of John Bachman, who was our chairman and someone that was my mentor and working with Bill Danforth during those years in the 18 years that I served as CEO of the regional chamber, when we started focusing on where our strengths could be, and we started focusing on plant and life sciences and focusing on advanced manufacturing, and as you and Jim are doing here, focusing on financial tech, fintech, and spatial finance, and so on, and related tech, um, we're playing to our strengths. And I suggested to Andy that in many ways he's the Bill Danforth of 2024, and he's too modest to accept that compliment. But I think the fact that we now have a mature Danforth Plant Sciences Center for Plant Sciences and an innovation district there, we have a mature Cortex focused on life sciences, and what you and Jim and Steve Stone are doing here with the efforts on the Downtown North Insight District around tech, fintech, geospatial intelligence, with the new NGA headquarters being 5 blocks north of here. I think that's the next cluster around which St. Louis can build an economic future, and we need to make the most of it.
So let's go back to you were in Denver in those two different roles as part of the partnership in the chamber until 1994. And so when you came to St. Louis in 94 and was recruited, when you got here, what did you see? What were your impressions, and what was your charge to work on?
Well, first of all, I wasn't looking to leave Denver. And a headhunter who was trying to recruit a friend of mine who headed the Greater Baltimore Committee, and he kept turning them down. And he finally said, if you want somebody like me, there's a friend of mine in Denver who you might talk to, who's been there in that job long enough that maybe he wants a fresh opportunity to do something new. And so I got a cold call from a recruiter. Said to my wife, I don't know about this. She said, you ought to at least go see it. So I came out. It was a beautiful April day.
Maybe get a meal, kick
Yeah,
the tires, see the arch kind of thing. And
well,
what's the worst that can happen?
It was
right?
even better than that. Earl Harbison was president of Monsanto, and he was the chair of the board of RCGA. He met me at the airport. He drove me through Ladue. He drove me through Forest Park. He drove me up and down Portland and Westmoreland, saying these are typical residential build houses. And I called Sarah that night and I said, holy cow, I had no idea that St. Louis was this terrific. And of course, on the tour through the park, he pointed out the Science Center and the Art Museum and the History Museum. And so it was sort of, I was struck by that. And obviously, they followed up and we had further discussions, and ultimately was recruited to the job. My first day on the job, our offices were in what was then called the MCI building, now the Deloitte building, facing the arch over the river. And I'm looking out from my office, this wonderful view, and I said to a staff member, could I have a map of the region? And they brought me a map, and it was only Missouri. And I said, but isn't the region a bi-state region? And they said, well, it is, but Illinois doesn't really count. And I thought, that is a problem. And fortunately, during that time, there was a wonderful, not shy public sector. I think he was the only public sector member of the RCGA board or executive committee, named John Berglund, Civic, who was the county chair of St. Clair County. And he was a regionalist at heart and a St. Clair County and Illinois advocate within the region. And he would let you know if you were getting off course. And so that was one impression. The other impression was, in looking at the data, which I'd done some of that homework before I took the job, I saw that the region had not had net job growth for over a decade. And the defense cutbacks that took
Right.
place were a part of that, to be sure. But the more I looked into it, the more I discovered that economic development was described as how many jobs primarily St. Louis County had recruited out of downtown St. Louis. And I I met with the head of the county economic council at the time, and I said, "What are you going to do when you run out of jobs in the city? Don't you think the lens needs to be a lot broader than that?" And so we had the good fortune of creating a parallel. Andy Craig and David Kemper were very active in this process. Andy Craig then being the CEO of Boatman's and then becoming the chairman of Bank of America, and David at Commerce. And Earl Harbison, and they had created an entity called the Greater St. Louis Economic Development Council. And it was sort of the St. Louis equivalency of the Greater Denver Corporation. And we went through a similar process. We capitalized that to the tune of, I want to say, $12 million. And one of the centerpieces of that is, how do we learn to behave regionally? How do we create the St. Louis equivalency of the Metro Denver network? And we did that. And for about 10 years, it worked reasonably well. A big part of that was people like Steve Ellman in St. Charles County, who is as staunch an advocate of St. Charles County as you can get, but he thinks regionally. And he got it, that it was important for the region to be thinking in that manner. And so we, at the end of that first economic development campaign, we'd set a goal of a net 100,000 jobs, which, against a backdrop of 10 years of no net job growth, was an important number. And we hit 112,000 on that first campaign.
This would have been in the 90s.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And subsequent to that, John Bachman, we had the great fortune of John becoming our chairman. In fact, he's, I think, the only person in the 180-year history of the St. Louis Chamber to serve 3 terms as chairman of the board. John, of course, was at that point 22 years as the CEO of Edward Jones. And John had become a colleague of Michael Porter at Harvard, who had perfected the whole idea of industry clusters and of looking at vertical strengths and where you play your shots. And that's how we discovered this thing that we didn't even think about as an industry cluster called Plant and Life Sciences, which we later branded the BioBelt. And what we partnered with the Danforth Foundation and co-funded the Battelle study. And that said to us, their 2 conclusions were, if you get your act together, you can be a top 10 life science community. That includes something like Cortex, early stage venture capital, branding yourselves. But in plant sciences, because of the Peter Ravens of the world and because of the Danforth Plant Science Center, which had already become a reality, you can be the best in the world in plant sciences. And so that became the model for how do we go about focusing our economic development strengths. And advanced manufacturing took on certain aspects. And initially it was financial services, and thanks to what you and Jim are doing here, is now become fintech and spatial finance, and kind of parallels what's happening in geospatial in very constructive ways. So, I see that evolution from the beginning in the mid '90s up through the 18 years. I stepped down in 2012 to head the company that I now head.
The community development ventures, you call yourself a civic entrepreneur.
Yes. I work with groups like the district here, and worked with a firm out of Silicon Valley to help a couple of places around the country. We helped Long Island create an entity that brought the venture community together with the universities. But I'm enjoying that, and enjoying working with you and Jim and Steve on what you're doing with this evolving district. And
it takes a while.
It does, but it took 20 years for Cortex to be where it is today. But at the end of the day, I see a vision for what you are doing and your colleagues are doing, that Washington Avenue gets revitalized to where it was in the late 90s. And Tucker Boulevard goes north all the way up to Northside and NGA, and it becomes the equivalency of a Cortex is 200 acres. It's
And I think in part we tend to think in terms of real estate as a place that you've got Plant Life Sciences out at what's now 39 North.
right.
It's going through that.
Yes,
Cortex is or BioSTL, Global STL, and those extensions. So instead of greenhouses, if you need lab space, you go there.
right.
And we're working due to the proximity to the NGA and other things that you've mentioned, working on that geospatial angle. And so to the degree that St. Louis had, the original reason for St. Louis to be was it was an inland river port,
Right.
the jump off spot. And then there was a point when that really wasn't the steamboats and whatnot weren't really stopping here, but you had the barge traffic going by. And St. Louis was able to successfully pivot into a manufacturing economy and everything
Right.
that went along with that, logistics, transportation, because we're in the middle of
Right.
the country. And St. Louis did not pivot well away from, not just in St. Louis, but the United States in general, where manufacturing went overseas.
Correct.
And so the question is, can we take those lessons that you've got from Denver? Because it sounds like there's some interesting parallels. This is a different time.
Yes, yes.
But ultimately, it does get back to what is the economic engine for the region. And, Las Vegas has gaming, for example.
Yeah.
Or
I'm glad we don't have that.
well, it's probably not a bad thing, but you need something. Or if you're if you're New Orleans, besides that being the entertainment, it's a large inland port where large boats and there's oil and natural gas down there, and every time a boat goes in and out of there, they pay the
Right.
meter, and that helps that going.
Right.
And St. Louis doesn't necessarily have that, and then everything that goes along with that. And so if you don't have the population growth, one of the things that was really gratifying, I think we were both at, was celebrating the growth in the foreign-born population.
Oh,
We
absolutely.
went in 1 year from 130,000 to 160,000,
Yes.
30,000 new for the region,
Yes.
which is really exciting, and a lot of the work that the International Institute has been going. And again, you start to look at that, and that's a very old organization, but in a lot of ways, with the work that I think it's Anna Crosland did, and
Yes,
now
she
Ari
did for years.
Ordenson,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you're starting to see that to the degree that you have alignment of different forces, you can really start to have a significant impact.
No, there's no question about that. I really tip my hat to the International Institute, to the Archbishop, and to Jerry Schlichter, who, basically said when there was this
The Afghan
flood of
refuge-
Afghan
yeah.
refugees that many cities were saying, stay away. We said, welcome you. And they helped them find housing and job training and language training, and entrepreneurs are developing. And there's an Afghan newspaper and an Afghan Chamber of Commerce.
And the religious, the temples and things like that,
yeah,
and the
and
places of worship. Yeah.
Similar things happened with the Bosnian population. And I know immigration, hopefully after we get past November, we can start thinking about immigration in objective terms again. But the fact is, places like St. Louis are created by our forefathers and mothers who were immigrants.
Right,
And-
German and
yeah,
Irish and Polish and,
yeah,
and
and
Sicilians.
St. Louis would not be St. Louis without the various levels of immigration. So one, the fact that we have distinguished ourselves as a welcoming place for resettlement of talent at a time when workforce is one of the biggest challenges in fulfilling our potential in any of these industries. A second issue, which is kind of a sad one, but seeing the devastation that is happening from climate change impacts in places as far away from the water as North Carolina and Georgia, inland Georgia, and so on. At this point, at least, St. Louis and the Midwest are not in the heart of that kind of swath of challenge by climate change. And obviously, we want to see the impacts that have happened to our fellow citizens in North Carolina and Florida get remedied get solutions to avoid it in the future. But in an interesting way, the Midwest is somewhat insulated from that, and not just Missouri. And that's another sort of natural advantage that can play to a strength that we might not think about otherwise.
So you had sent me a link of yourself on the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour, which you have to be a certain age, I think, to know what that was. And you were part of the transition from the Ford administration to the Carter administration. And there was an interesting question there that I want to tie in.
Sure.
I don't remember whether it was McNeil or Lehrer who asked you this question, but in the Carter administration, there was intent on what we would call DEI hiring right now.
Right.
And basically, I think you got a very pointed question. How are you going to fill all these roles? Do you really have qualified people to do that?
Yes.
And, in some ways, tying it back to now, 50 years later, and we've got this 2030 jobs plan and being inclusive and doing that. Do we still have that same issue of getting people who are trained? There's a lot of underrepresented people who have struggled to get into places like Penn and Harvard who don't have that training, as well as the economic issues. How do we tackle this DEI requirement in a meaningful way? It's the question really that different than it was 50 years ago?
I think it's different in at least one way. It's still a human and moral issue for people to provide opportunity to people. People who, but for where they were born or the family they were born to, could have one future or another. But the thing that's emerged in 2024 that's a bit different than it was when we were recruiting for the Carter cabinet or the senior officers in the Carter transition, which was the area I was responsible, is we need talent. Take geospatial, take fintech, take plant and life sciences.
Huge shortages for
There is a
people.
tremendous shortage. It's why the issue of either or on immigration has become so irrational. Clearly, the security side of immigration is a legitimate one to have in terms of if there are people coming into the country who are bringing illegal activity. But the other side of the issue is the talent pipeline. And this whole issue that's happened in Springfield, Ohio, which is sort of mind-boggling, is the people who are there from the Haitian community are filling jobs that were vacant. And the Republican mayor and the Republican governor have been very critical of what has been the discussion of describing that as a negative when
it should be a positive.
it should be a
Unfortunately, it's
positive.
become a political football.
Yeah, and hopefully that we get past the election and we get back to treating the issue in a rational way. Who knows?
So the way that we tell stories now is a little bit different in as far as different media, and I guess people still are on PBS, and there isn't quite the reach. And we're sitting here having a podcast that hopefully a few people will listen to. One of those things that's fairly recent is social media, Facebook, Instagram, and I think LinkedIn. And you've been able to really leverage that. And I think you've got the largest number of followers on LinkedIn of anybody I know, which is
It's approaching 17,000.
just unbelievable. It's like rock star status,
Oh.
And so have you, in terms of using social media to get the word out and to communicate with people, helpful in some ways, maybe not in others? I mean,
It's overwhelmingly, my experience has been on the positive and constructive side. As you know, I write a fair amount about these issues. Write for Geospatial World magazine that's based in India, but it is the industry magazine for geospatial intelligence. And more recently, I've been writing for a London-based magazine called Foreign Direct Investment International, which is their audience is site selectors who choose where to show companies they could locate, hopefully locating here in St. Louis. And when I write an article in those publications, I often repost it on LinkedIn. And it's interesting the traction it gets, the number of reposts, and sometimes
You
3 to
just never,
5,000 likes.
or you just never know how something will get picked up,
Yeah,
pushed out.
yeah,
Someone reads something and
yeah,
goes, "Huh, maybe we'll
yeah,
we'll give St. Louis another look."
yeah. And I'm blocking his name now, but there was a famous general, like during must have been during the second Bush administration. He sent me a note on LinkedIn on one of these articles on geospatial. And it was a personal note saying, I'm involved with the venture fund and we're looking for promising startups. If you run across any in geospatial there in St. Louis, and I thought one of my friends was gigging me on this
Yeah,
and was
right.
kidding me that this
Yeah.
was the case. And through a couple of sources that knew this general,
Was it Petraeus
yes,
or
it was
yeah,
Petraeus.
yeah.
Thank you. And they said, no, that is General Petraeus. So you never know who's going to read what you put online, which cautions you to put online stuff that's on target.
Well, it doesn't seem like you're slowing down at all.
No,
You're
not a bit. Not a
still
bit.
writing and stumping for St. Louis. It's great.
As they say, you can take the guy out of the chamber, but you can't take the chamber out of the guy. So
That's great. Well, any parting words or anything on final thoughts here that maybe we haven't covered?
no, I just commend you for doing the series on Insight City. I think it all helps with the narrative, and the more people that can understand it, the better. My Uber driver coming over here, he just moved here from, I think, the Virgin Islands. He's been here for a couple of years. When I started telling him about where we were going to this building and what the district was and what NGA was, he got excited. My Uber driver this morning, he said, "Well, my son is in school on Jefferson Boulevard or whatever the Jefferson's called, and he didn't know about NGA." And I said, "Well, what's your son want to do?" And he said, "Well, he's kind of into tech." I told him about Zakita's new
Uh-huh.
center. I said, the two of you should just go up there and kick the tires, and he might get
Absolutely.
inspired. So having people exposed to the sort of things that you're featuring in these podcasts is good.
Well, I do think because it's part of the whole language and thoughts, and can become actions, and words
Yeah,
matter. And so, to the degree that we're helping to change the narrative of what it means to be downtown,
yeah,
and it's different than people think it is.
oh yeah. And at the end of the day, good activity overcomes bad activity, and we're going to see that.
It's a good way to finish up. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay.